So this is this presentation, this talk about alternatives to traditional scorecards is something that comes out of my work at the University of Pennsylvania, leading a project on educational leadership simulation. And we've worked closely with NexLearn over the last couple of years on creating simulations that can be used for pre-service and in-service school leaders to develop their skills as school leaders in leadership decision-making skills. One of the challenges in that field is that it's very insular. And you have a principal of a high school here, and you have a principal of an elementary school or another high school over there, and they're dealing with their decision making, and they never have an opportunity to talk or think about what the rationale is for those decisions. So we created this program to develop those simulations. And actually, one of the things I'll talk about tomorrow is our model, which is so we talk about SMEs. We actually have our subject matter experts as authors of the sims, and they're practitioners. So we have a cohort of fellows who are current superintendents, principals, assistant principals, independent school heads who come together and collaboratively author in SimWriter the simulations based on their problems of practice. And our implementation is around what we call social learning. And we'll talk about that in my presentation to tomorrow, which was supposed to be before this presentation. So you would have had a little bit of information, more background then. So pretend that you have that background now. You'll get it tomorrow. And we'll go from there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving you an overview of the project specifically, because this context and this presentation is not just about educational leadership. It's about all of the various contexts where the leadership experiences, the leadership decisions are not clear-cut. There's not right answers. And so one of the things that, as I started learning about simulations 4 and 5 years ago when I began getting involved in this project, was the understanding that in terms of training, and this is this training, right, that a lot of simulation use in training is training where there's compliance requirements, where the goal is to say, this is what you're supposed to do, and here's the consequences if you don't. Here's the consequences when you do, the reward type consequences, etc. And our project had a tremendous resistance to this, because in school leadership, there are very few right answers. Okay? The majority of those decisions are decisions that vary based on context, based on the personalities involved, based on the moment in time, and that what the quote-unquote right decision would be will vary based on what building you're in, based on what community you're in, based on what type of school you are, based on who the students are in your school at the time, who the parents are in the school at your time, and a decision that you would make this year to respond to a situation is different than a decision you would make next year. And not to mention that all of this is happening in a very, very high-paced environment where the decisions have to be made oftentimes quickly. So we were very resistant to creating simulations that intended to tell or to direct a school leader down a particular path, that this is the way you should handle such and such a circumstance. So I'll give you a very concrete, very simple example of this. So one of the simulations we developed, a pilot simulation, is about a principal who goes home, turns on the cable access channel, and has the Board of Education meeting, and a parent from that principal's school is at the board of you are the principal in the simulation. A parent comes up on the TV and says, I'm so-and-so, mother of such and such student at the high school, and my daughter is on the basketball team, and the coach has been swearing and berating our daughters on the team. And I'm dissatisfied with this. It's unacceptable. And there you are watching this parent going to the Board of Ed, complaining about your coach, she never came to you, etc. So you go in the next morning, and the first decision that you're faced with is, who do you call? Do you call the superintendent right away? Do you call the athletic director? Do you call the coach in? Do you call the students in, who the daughter of that parent? Do you call the parent? And here's the thing. So a lot of people will say, well, you call the superintendent right after that Board of Ed meeting's over or whatever. Well, that's not one of the choices in the simulation, but some people say call the superintendent first. If you get in a room of school leaders, some school leaders will say, I can never call my superintendent if I do not already know the answer. Other people will tell you, as soon as I have an issue, my superintendent wants to hear from me before I do anything. And neither of those are wrong answers. They're just different answers. And if you are directing through the simulation a path that says this is the right choice and this is the wrong choice, you can cause people to learn the wrong behavior in that kind of a context. So when I was starting to develop this presentation in November, so it's not totally last minute, I was searching because a lot of this was stuff that we talked about in our group. But we haven't written on it yet, we haven't published on it yet, and we haven't presented on it yet. This idea of the no right answers. I've argued with Ken Spiro about it plenty, but there's not necessarily been anything that we've done to formalize it. So I started searching, and I started trying to find the nature of leadership decision making as a complex system. And so I found a couple of articles and I saved them and I kind of put them aside. And then when I came back to this, I realized that through Dennis's watch, the NSA is inevitably going to be paying attention to this, because Snowden is the author of this Cynefin Framework. It's not that Snowden, but I'm sure that that's a key word that comes up in the search catching categories. So anyway, this is the Cynefin Framework, which I came to as I was researching this, which describe different kinds of contexts or problems or typologies of leadership situations. And the four situations that Snowden and Boone describe are complex situations, complicated situations, simple situations, chaotic situations, or contexts. And a guy by the name of Andrew Cerniglia has kind of placed this into a diagram that helps understand what each of these kinds of scenarios or situations might look like. So the first two, which I think are where the majority of simulations are used in traditional training, at least as in my experience, are simple and complicated contexts. Now, one of the things that I think is important when you have this conversation is that this is not to say that if you have a simple context, that somehow you're less important, less meaningful, your work is less intensive. To be honest, there are advanced surgical techniques that are simple contexts, right? They're simple because they're straightforward management, they're very easily discernible, and the answer's likely obvious. Okay? That doesn't mean that it's a less important decision. It doesn't mean that it's a less important scenario. The dangers in those situations is that sometimes we oversimplify them. And if you think about this in terms of writing a simulation, if you oversimplify the simulation, and Clark talked about this a little bit also, is that context, that feeling of realness that people are able to connect with disappears, right? If you oversimplify it. Even in a simple context. There's an entrained thinking, and there's complacency that happens in these. So the doctor who does the appendectomy has done 350 appendectomies. It is very typical, very discernible, very straightforward management. They get in there, and then so the one example would be somebody who has, and my wife's a physician, so I don't remember the word for it, but she could tell you where their organs are flipped. Okay, so there are people that the organs are flipped. So someone comes in, they've got pain, they have all of the symptoms of an appendicitis attack, and you're going to go in and do the surgery, and you don't do an ultrasound first because you know it's appendicitis, and you're ready to do the surgery, and you go in and you open them up, and there's no appendix because it's on the other side. And again, this is this complacency. Well, you're like, well, I know what this is. No, you might not know what it is. And so those are the dangers of a simple context. And those, I mean, this guide to me is something that can be very helpful in authoring a simulation of a simple context. Because these are the kind of dangers that you want your consequences to account for. Okay? And so in addressing a simple context problem, you sense the problem, you categorize it, and then you respond to it. Okay? In a complicated situation or a complicated context, we get into Don Rumsfeld world, and we have known unknowns. And then we have unknown knowns and known unknown knowns and unknown known knowns and whatever else Rumsfeld said back then. And these contexts require expertise. They require expertise to discern them, to understand what's happening. And the dangers in these complicated contexts are, again, same thing, entrained thinking. When we get into this mindset of mechanicalized thinking, this is a danger. Now, also, we have both of the second and third examples are very interconnected, but novel solutions are ignored by experts. And so you think about coaching, for example. Somebody brought up coaching before as an example. Coaching is a way that even the most elite athletes have coaches. And the coaches are there to say to them, okay, here's a way to adjust. Derek Jeter, here's a way to adjust your swing. Here's your, this is, your elbow is the wrong angle. Or, now we learn that it's not, you don't need a wide stance. If you narrow your, these kinds of changes that may have been the expert thought, when you're expert in something, when you've known how to do it, you don't necessarily think about newer ways of approaching a problem or a context. And then you have ego as a problem that comes up. Now, ego, I think, is something that's hard to deal with in a traditional simulation context because people don't like to admit that they have ego, and they know when you're prompting them with ego, right? So they don't take the bait typically. That takes a lot of care to try to address that. But the strategy difference between a simple and a complicated problem is that you sense the problem, but then you have to analyze it. There's this other step of figuring it out before you respond to it. But in both of these cases, we're talking about, and here's an awful version of Clark's image from his screen. In both of those examples, you follow this flow chart. And there are correct choices that have consequences, and there are wrong choices that have consequences. And regardless of whether it is a complicated or a simple scenario or context, the choices, there are some things that you shouldn't be doing in this context, and there are certain things you're supposed to be doing. And these result in a traditional scorecard that I'll put up here in the form of A, B, C, D, F. But what I did is I went through and I just got some examples of how these look, right? It doesn't have to be A, B, C, D, F. It could be a balanced scorecard. It could be any kind of mindset of traditional scorecards where there is an indication, a clear indication of bad, okay, best, or good, better, best, or however you want to contextualize that. And this is one example. Here's another example where there's scores out of a certain number of points. Okay, we have an example of one of NexLearn's demos where you have a warm or a cool, warm kind of rating scale that advances as you're going and giving you instant feedback. In any of these cases, these are based on making right and wrong choices, where it's like a stoplight, right? If you do the wrong choice, your score is going to go down, and if you do the right choice, your score is going to go up. And it is this idea that there's an up and a down, right? And what these do is they direct the learning experience to say, oh, my score just went down, so that was a bad choice. That is, not only is there an inherently built-in consequence by the customer yelling back at you in the simulation, but there's also a consequence in the feedback from the scorecard that says this was a bad choice. Okay? Now, in a simulation, I'll come back to the school leadership simulations in a second and talk about consequences. But chaotic contexts in Snowden's typology is, the chaotic contexts to me are probably not contexts that are ideal for simulation. Now, there are contexts that we might think are chaotic, but that are not. So war, for example, right? The US military is the ultimate simulation research body and the ultimate simulation practitioner, both from billion-dollar aircraft simulators to tabletop war strategy simulation. That is a science for them. And the decisions that are made in battle are science-based decisions, at least if you went to the U.S. Military Academy and listened to any lecture there, that's what you would be told, is that there are right and wrong choices to make when you're in a foxhole. These are decisions that are taught, and the leadership of those situations is taught. And so that is a scenario that might seem like it's chaotic, like for us, if we are not people who've ever been in the military or in battle, we might think, oh my gosh, there's bullets flying all over the place. Same thing if you're talking about law enforcement and the way that you clear a house, right? It's like, it is not chaotic. It's very specific, ordered, well thought out and planned, okay? Chaotic scenarios are scenarios that genuinely, not apparently, but genuinely have no answers, no patterns, they're only unknowables, okay? They're arenas for innovation because you have to decide what to do, because you still have to decide. It's just that there's no pattern. This is not something that will ever be recreated in a way. And this, again, this transferability that Clark talked about, where if you learn how to do something in a very micro sense, your ability to transfer that skill to some other place goes away because you're very micro-focused. And the detail is so exact to whatever you are going to do that the only thing you learn is the very specific example. Chaotic situations, it doesn't matter how general or detailed they are. Those situations are not ones that you can truly learn from, even in retrospect. You can debrief and you can talk about how you responded in crisis. So, for example, the Newtown school shooting is chaos, okay? It is not necessarily chaos from the perspective that how to respond to a school shooting from the outside, but it is chaos when those situations arise in an environment. You can strategize, you can talk about ways to reduce things, but every one of these shootings that we've heard about, from Columbine through the mall shooting in Maryland the other day, through every one of these, the player is different. The suspect is different, and they don't have the same motivations, and they don't have the same rationale, and the responses are different. And so the rules are all off. And you can learn from chaotic situations, but you can't learn from chaotic situations to be ready to deal with the next chaotic situation. You can just learn things about yourself. You can learn things about your organization. You can learn things about your systems. Okay? So we won't talk about those. But what I want to focus on are these complex contexts. So the traits of complex contexts are that there's no one right answer. Okay? It doesn't mean that there aren't right answers, but there is not one right answer. Okay? And the system is in constant flux. So the variables that contribute to what the right answers might be are constantly changing. And the ability to understand the decision-making process and what happened during that situation or scenario come at the end. They come after, when you look backwards, and you're able to then start to see the patterns that have emerged. So, for example, dealing with angry parents if you're a principal, right? This is an example where every parent you deal with, there's differences, okay? You can't be, and the reasons that the parent is angry vary. And the threat that the parent poses to you is different. And the background of the parent is different. But there are patterns that emerge over time in the ways that parents react or interact with the schools. And those patterns are things that in retrospect you can start to learn things from. The dangers of these complex systems is that you go back to strategies. It is actually a danger in responding to a complex system to think of it as a simple system. To think, one of the biggest threats to school leaders is to think you know how to deal with a situation because you've dealt with the situation before, and so you now know the right way. That's a huge threat because it blinds you to the variables that are occurring in the context. Okay, impatience is also a variable, a danger, a threat, because we want to know the right answer. Okay, one of the reasons that my wife is a physician is because, I also have a law degree, and when I was going to law school, I remember driving to a casino. We didn't have kids yet. We were going away to a casino, and it was like the first week of one of my classes in law school, and I was reading a case to her, and she wanted to know what the right answer was. And I said, well, there's not a right answer, right? It depends on the facts. She says, well, there has to be, she's a scientist, so she wants to know what's the right answer. And she gets very impatient in those kinds of conversations because she's like, when I talk about my work, it's a big circle. When she talks about her work, it's like this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and we did that. When I talk about it, she's like, well, get to the point. And I'm like, well, the story is the point. For her, the point is the person is better and they went home. So that's the difference. And then over control, which happens a lot in schools and happens a lot in these kinds of environments where somebody, the leader, the decision maker, tries to control the variables so much so that you can't start to see what the patterns are to be better at responding to the circumstances when they arise in the future. And the difference in strategy from complex to those other categories is that first you have to probe. First you have to figure out what the variables are. It looks like a familiar problem, but you need to probe and investigate. And then you need to sense. After you've got some information, you need to sense what's going on here. And then you can first respond. So these, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because this is Snowden's article explaining what I just talked about. But basically, there are large numbers of interacting elements in these kinds of complex scenarios. And they're not linear. And minor changes, parent is a board member, parent is uneducated, parent is a foster parent. Minor changes can have major consequences disproportionate to the nature of the problem. Okay, dynamic situation, right? So things are happening in the school and things change very rapidly. So, you're having a major crisis with this family because the parent is sick. And then you have, in the middle of trying to handle that, you have another crisis arise because there's some public health threat. So H1N1 a couple of years ago, which I guess came back this year, but H1N1 came out, and all of a sudden we're in the middle of trying to do all of our regular things, but we also had to figure out what do we do if 60% of our students are absent tomorrow, right? And these things are constantly happening in school leadership or other kinds of complex contexts, and these dynamic circumstances create a difficulty with imposing particular solutions. And then the system has history, and again, this is where I talk about, do you call the superintendent first or do you not, right? That's based on the superintendent. You get a new superintendent, that rule goes away. That history is based on that superintendent. So there's history in these systems, these complex systems. Now, again, complex systems oftentimes, after the fact, we look at them and we say, oh, that makes sense. This is what's going to happen every time. It isn't. But it looks like it because it seems logical in retrospect. So again, this idea of you need to understand the constant changes in the system. And unlike in the ordered systems, so simple or complicated, the system constrains the agents. You only have so many choices, and the choices are this or this, and they're good or bad choices. And in chaotic systems, there's no constraints. Agents to system, system to agents, there's no constraints. In the complex system, the agents in the system constrain one another. They go back and forth. So my learning who my superintendent was when I was a principal changed how I responded to things. And my changing how I responded to things changed how my superintendent acted, which in turn changed how I responded to things, which in turn, right? And this is how this process goes. And so this is different than, sometimes we call them learning systems, not in the sense of learning like educational, but the systems learn over time and they learn from the things that happen in the system and change. So back to Clark's image. And I changed it. I took the liberty of editing it and cutting out the correct answer there and pasting it there and saying that basically you have in these complex systems context answers. There are multiple choices still, but they're context choices. And what may seem like it's a right answer or a right choice may or may not be a right answer or a right choice. So yes, sir.
Might an alternative also be no correct answer? Kobayashi-Maru?
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And the other piece, and this I'll talk a little bit about in the social learning discussion tomorrow, is that a lot of times the choices that aren't even there need to be talked about. The variables that aren't considered need to be talked about, especially when we're dealing with linear branching simulations that don't account for all of the things that might happen. And again, certainly when you get into the chaotic systems, there are no answers, right? Even in a complex system, though, there may not be an answer you can choose in this moment. So it might just be cross your fingers and wait. Right? I mean, those could be variables. And so absolutely, that's important. But the point being that how do we shift this then from those traditional scorecards to some sort of meaningful feedback? And so I used to be of the mind that we don't do any scorecard in this. We don't put any value judgment. We don't do any scorecard. And to Ken's credit, he convinced me as we talked that maybe there's some value to some kind of scorecard. So what are some alternatives to traditional scorecards that work for a complex kind of a system and that you can take the technology in, whether it's in SimWriter or it's in some other tool, you can take the technology that's there and provide these kind of scores. Basically, I look at it as Continuum. And there are different kinds of ways to construct to understand what we mean by continuum. So one way would be what I would call a single-strand continuum. And you can have multiple single-strand continuums, but a single-strand continuum would be like budget conservation versus budget expenditure. And the choices that you make in this simulation, depending on what choice you make at each point that happens to have budget implications, you're either spending less or spending more. Okay? And that the resulting scorecard, the resulting score, doesn't say that spending less is better or spending more is worse. It just says, where are you? How tight or loose are you with the purse strings? There are absolutely people who would say you need to be looser with the purse strings because every year you're ending up with surplus, and because of funding mechanisms, surplus goes back to the town and blah, blah, blah. There could be cases made. Okay, so this could be any kind of single-strand continuum. It could be anything. It could be, fidelity to the high fidelity to the curriculum, low fidelity to the curriculum, or degree of customer centricity, right? Low customer centricity, high customer centricity. Okay. Again, we might argue that in that kind of an example, low customer centricity is bad. But there's a place for discussion of that then. You're not saying it's bad. You're just objectively placing people on a continuum. Then you can get into more competing interests. You can start to say one end of the continuum is one type of interest, which in the example I'd put is if your decisions are student-centered versus teacher-centered. Now, there's reasons that you might want to be more student-centered, or there's reasons that you might want to be more teacher-centered in a school context. We're not saying that one of those is right or wrong, but we're saying that, and how do you take a standard scorecard mechanism to do this? Basically, if you think of it as a 0 to 5 score, just because the average is a 0 doesn't mean 0 is a bad number, and you don't have to ever tell anybody that it's a 0. You just put them here. You put them there. That's a 0. Well, 0 happens to be budget conservation, or 0 happens to be student-centered, and if their score ends up as a 4.8, they're over here, teacher-centered, right? And then you're identifying choice 1. If they make that choice, is that a student-centered choice? Is it a heavily student-centered choice? Or is it a teacher-centered choice, or a heavily teacher-centered choice? And it's almost like a Likert scale, right? Strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree. And you place them on that scale. It's still going to come out with an average number. That average number is just going to put you somewhere on the continuum, whichever continuum. Going a little bit more complex, you can get into something like a weighted axes, where you have like leadership styles, and you might have leadership where there's more leader control on this axis and more employee control there, more people orientation and more task orientation. And then what you do is you can gap these scores, and the result is placing people in a quadrant on the chart. And it shows them where their decision making falls. What kind of leader were they? What was their style? And for some people going through the simulation, they say, gosh, I really thought that I was people oriented, and it looks like I'm not. Now, that may mean that I'm going to decide to change my decision-making so that I can be more people-oriented. Or it can mean I like the decision-making I do and I've been successful, so maybe I've been wrong thinking that I should be people-oriented and I should be focused on task. Whatever the case might be, it doesn't say to them, you're task-oriented, we don't like you. Right? Or you need to be more people-oriented, because there is absolutely an argument to be made for somebody who falls right there as being the best. But there's also an argument to be made that someone who falls right there is jack of all trades, master of none. Right? And depending on your context, these foster conversation. So what are some of the notes that I was thinking when we're talking about simulating these complex contexts? Well, as the simulation is written, the authors are going to write some choices that are seemingly better choices than others. But the scoring of those choices is not going to be on the basis of saying this is good and this is bad. They're going to be on the basis of saying this is more of this kind of choice. Now, I, as the author, might be people-centered. And so when I make a response that's task-centered, I think that's a bad choice as the author, but I know it's a choice. It's a way to handle it. It doesn't mean that it is a bad choice, but for me as the author, it might be a less good choice. The other thing that's an important, I'll sometimes say, like, this is like the dirty little secret of this whole conversation, is that there are still some wrong answers. So we have one simulation that Brandon will remember us filming, which was a simulation of a teacher who was violating the school dress code. There were wrong answers when you were talking to that teacher about her dress. Like, no, you look really hot. It's just that they must all be jealous of you. That's a wrong answer. So just because you have this mindset of, there aren't any wrong answers, there aren't any right answers, it doesn't mean there aren't wrong answers. Now, when you're not doing a scale that says that's a wrong answer, that becomes a different way of handling it within the simulation. And what we had is our guide comes on and says, this would be a good time to review your district's Title IX policies. And, it is a hard stop, right? It's not just going to show up in the form of a feedback on a chart that you are, what is your scale, what is your placement on the continuum of sexual harasser? Very sexually harassing, not very sexually harassing. You wouldn't do that. You would still point out some of those wrong answers. When there are really bad ways of handling things in these complex contexts, you still want to give the consequence. Now, the better way in the immersive environment would be before the guide comes on and says, check the Title IX policy, it would be for you to receive the complaint from the superintendent that says, a formal complaint has been filed, and the superintendent would like to see you in her office. And you go down to her office, and she says to you, did you really say, quote, and then it says on the simulation, you feel a pit forming in your stomach. And then your guide comes on and says, it is a good time to review your Title IX policies, right? And sometimes those wrong answers are not as obvious as the wrong answer in this situation, but sometimes there are things that you just can't do. And you want to make sure that those are highlighted. The other thing is, back to Clark's point, that all decisions have consequences. Sometimes they're good consequences, okay? And when you're writing a simulation, even when the simulation is of a complex system, your responses have to have consequences, and not be consequences that are consistent with what the person in their environment thinks would happen. So if you don't call the superintendent, and the superintendent gets pissed off that you didn't call her, that is a consequence in this sim that me, working in the Hartford, Connecticut public schools, knows I would never call the superintendent for this. And if I called her for this, she would be like, why are you bothering me? Who is this again? Right? And that's fine. Because then when you come back to the social learning part of this and you discuss, which is tomorrow's discussion, you then talk about that. And that's when the reason, because somebody else in that room is saying, who would ever pick don't call your superintendent? And now their brain is closed to this option that may be something that they need to know for the next district that they work in, or when the new superintendent comes into their district. And then this idea of continuums, and this to me is the key takeaway of this whole discussion. And this dovetails into tomorrow's presentation, which is continuums for scoring should support, not direct, the discussion. So if you have a scorecard, a traditional scorecard, the scorecard directs the debrief. It directs the discussion. What did you do wrong? Then that becomes your starting point. You didn't do well in this category. What could you have done differently that would have been better? In a continuum-oriented, non-traditional scorecard in a complex system, the conversation is supported by the scorecard. So in other words, we're discussing it and we're saying, what kind of leader did you think you were in this simulation? The choices I made suggest that I'm a people-centered leader, or that I'm an authoritarian leader, or that I'm a laissez-faire leader, or whatever this continuum-oriented scorecard suggests. And then so you say, well, what does that mean? And then somebody else says, well, it means maybe you could be more directive. Well, I don't want to be more directive. Well, it's not a bad thing that you're and that's the conversation. The scorecard, the continuum-based scorecard, becomes part of the discussion, not the director of the discussion. It becomes a probe. It becomes a prompt. It doesn't become a direction. And to me, that's the... did I talk long enough? To me, that's the essence of this presentation and this concept, is that the scorecard, the concept of scoring, in especially these complex systems, should be to facilitate that conversation, that discussion. Tomorrow, I'll talk about our social learning process, which can be applicable regardless of what kind of scorecard you're using. So even if your context to use a more traditional scorecard, or they're more simple or complicated problems, you can still have a social learning mindset. And then I'll also talk a little bit about our subject matter expert authoring, so this concept of experiential validity. So that's it for me for now.